The winter of 1890 sat heavily over the small town of Blackwood, the kind of place that lived quietly on the edge of maps. The streets were narrow, lined with wooden houses that leaned toward one another as if whispering secrets. Smoke rose from stone chimneys, and the sound of horse hooves clattered on cobblestones, breaking the silence only long enough to remind people that life, though simple, still moved. But inside one grand home, larger than most and set apart by iron gates, there was a story no one yet dared to tell. A family lived there who seemed ordinary at first glance, polite, well-kept, and wealthy enough to carry themselves with dignity. But behind the glass windows and drawn curtains, something about them never seemed to change. The home itself carried an unease. It was built of red brick, tall and unyielding, its windows dark even when candles burned inside. Locals spoke quietly when they passed by, noticing how the garden never lost its color, even in the coldest months, and how the family inside seemed to remain untouched by time. Faces that were familiar in church or in the marketplace looked the same year after year. While neighbors grew older, hair turned gray, and lines creased faces, the members of that house stayed strangely still, as if the years slipped past without leaving a mark on them. At first, it was dismissed as good fortune, strong genes, or perhaps money's ability to shield one from the hardships of aging. But whispers grew heavier. For T, the center of this story was the father, a man respected in public, yet distant in his private world. His words were careful, often measured, as though he held back more than he ever shared. He carried an authority that no one questioned, even in his own family. His wife, by contrast, carried a gentle presence. She was pale and soft-spoken, her smile polite, but never quite reaching her eyes. Together, EY raised children who mirrored their quiet elegance. The children laughed, played, and studied like all the others, yet their voices carried an odd echo of sameness. Year after year, their appearances remained unchanged. They remained frozen in youth, drawing both admiration and fear from those who watched them from afar, but on the surface, their lives seemed enviable. The family dined in silver-lit rooms, their tables spread with meats, bread, and fruits, no matter the season. Music drifted through the halls when one of the children played the piano, their hands gliding across keys with practiced grace. Servants came and went quietly, their eyes lowered, never daring to speak of what they saw. But behind the stillness of that life, cracks began to show. The father's rules were strict, his hand heavy on anyone who stepped out of line. Conversations in the home were often muted, as though fear lived in every corner. The children, those smiling in public, sometimes looked away too quickly, their eyes carrying something they could not say. In the town, people spoke in hushed tones about how odd it was that no birthdays were ever celebrated. No candles, no cakes, no gatherings. The children never seemed to outgrow their clothes, and their mother, who should have aged beside her husband, looked the same as when she first arrived in Blackwood. Some dismissed it as a rumor, but others swore it was true. A doctor who once visited the home had left pale and shaken, never speaking of what he saw. A maid who worked for the family left after only a week, muttering about strange rules that forbade mirrors in the children's rooms and late-night whispers echoing through the halls. What struck most was how normal they wanted to appear. The father often attended town meetings, donating to churches and speaking of morality and community. The mother handed out baskets to the poor in winter, her soft hands wrapping bread in cloth. The children attended lessons with other families, but their presence brought unease. Their classmates grew, voices deepened, faces changed, while they remained the same. In photographs, taken years apart, they appeared untouched, standing in the same poses with the same features, like statues trapped in paper. Beneath the polished image, control ruled the family's life. The father's word was law. No one left the house after dark. No one questioned why they never aged. Servants who tried to ask found themselves dismissed without warning, their wages cut short. Rumors spread that within the family, emotions were repressed and love was something performed rather than felt. Behind closed doors, Arguments sparked quickly, voices raised and silenced in the same breath. The children sometimes vanished for days, hidden away in rooms no servant was allowed to enter. When they returned, they smiled wider than before, but their eyes looked dimmer, as though something inside had been taken from them. It was this fragile illusion of normalcy that gave way to suspicion. The family that should have embodied wealth and grace instead cast a shadow over the town. People avoided the street where the house stood, crossing to the other side rather than risk passing its gates. Yet fascination lingered. Some watched from a distance, drawn to the mystery of people who lived without aging, as if locked in time. For those who dared to look longer, the stillness was not beauty. It was unnatural. Something darker lurked beneath the polished walls, waiting for the moment when silence could no longer hold the truth. The story that would soon unravel began in that still house in the winter of 1890. It began with the family who had everything: money, status, appearances, and yet carried with them a secret that no amount of wealth could contain. A secret that hinted at manipulation, at hidden cruelty, and at choices so terrible they would mark Blackwood forever. The house stood tall. The family smiled in silence. But time itself seemed to pause, as though waiting for the day when the truth would finally demand to be seen. The silence that wrapped itself around the family's home in Blackwood began to feel heavier as the new year approached. It wasn't the kind of quiet born from peace, but rather one that hid whispers and unspoken fears. On the surface, life carried on as it always had: polite dinners, music drifting from the parlor, children smiling politely at church. But cracks in the perfect image widened, and those who lived within those brick walls felt the strain with every passing day. The father's control grew tighter as people's questions in town became louder. Neighbors wondered why his children still looked the same, why their mother's face hadn't softened with age, and why no one ever seemed to fall ill in their household. He would brush off these murmurs with sharp words about envy and ignorance, but inside the house he raged. He could not stand the thought of gossip threatening his reputation. His obsession with maintaining the family's perfect image turned the home into a prison, where every word, every gesture was measured. Tea, the dinner table. Silence stretched longer than the meals themselves. The children, once light-hearted, lowered their eyes when speaking. The mother's voice grew faint, as if she feared taking up space. The father's temper was unpredictable. A wrong glance or a delayed answer could spark his anger. His obsession was more than pride. It was fear. He knew something about their condition that others did not, and he feared it would spill out if he did not maintain absolute order. That fear transformed into cruelty cloaked as discipline, a need to control every moment in their lives. One of the children, the eldest daughter, began to test the boundaries of that control. She noticed how her classmates grew older while she remained unchanged. Their friendships shifted, conversations turned toward futures, marriage, work, travel, while she stood still in her youth. Whispers followed her at school. Girls who once giggled with her now avoided her, calling her cursed under their breath. Boys stared with suspicion instead of interest. She returned home with questions that her father refused to answer. Her anger burned quietly at first, but each dismissal only fueled it further. She began sneaking into the locked parts of the house. Desperate for answers. One night, she discovered a room hidden at the end of the second floor. Thus see, over the space, but inside, she found journals belonging to her mother. The entries were fragmented, some ripped out, but what remained hinted at something horrifying. Her mother had written of treatments, of nights spent locked in candlelit chambers, of her husband's endless experiments meant to preserve what he called purity of the bloodline. Words like serum, injections, and rituals were repeated, surrounded by pages soaked with ink smudged by tears. The daughter's heart raced as she read. Her father's obsession was not simply about image. It was about keeping them trapped in bodies that no longer moved with time. Her discovery marked the beginning of open defiance. She confronted her mother first, pleading for answers, but her mother only shook her head, whispering that silence was the only way to keep them safe. Her mother's eyes carried the weight of years of submission, a quiet suffering born of fear and resignation. But for the daughter, silence was unbearable. Each day, she watched her siblings play in the garden, laughing with the same voices, the same faces as they had for years, and she felt suffocated. Meanwhile, the town's suspicion grew. A merchant who had lived next to the family for decades swore that the children had not aged a single day. His insistence drew the attention of outsiders, scientists and journalists hungry for stories of the strange and unexplained. Rumors of a family immune to time spread beyond Blackwood, and strangers began lingering near the gates, sketching the house or waiting to catch a glimpse of its occupants. The father raged at the intrusion. He doubled the guards, dismissed servants he no longer trusted, and forbade his children from leaving the property. The more he tightened his grip, the more restless they became. Financial strain also crept into their lives. Though the family had long been wealthy, their fortune was not endless. The father spent a fortune on medicines, imported herbs, and secret shipments that arrived under the cover of night. He bribed doctors to remain silent and paid off officials to keep attention away. The more money he poured into maintaining their secret, the more desperate he grew. Behind closed doors, arguments with his wife turned violent. She begged him to stop, to allow their children to live normal lives, but he saw her pleas as weakness. Their marriage, once a careful performance of harmony, dissolved into bitterness and resentment. The eldest daughter's defiance grew bolder. She began writing her own journal, documenting everything she witnessed. She encouraged her younger siblings to question their father's rules, planting seeds of doubt. At night, they gathered in secret, whispering about the possibility of escape, of running into the town and finding someone who could help them. But fear always crept back in. Fear of their father, fear of the unknown, fear of what they had become. One evening, the tension broke into something dangerous. The daughter confronted her father in front of the entire family. She demanded the truth, her voice shaking but strong. Her father's face hardened. He rose from the table, striking her across the face with such force that her mother screamed. The children sat frozen in silence, their food untouched. In that moment, a line had been crossed. The father's violence was no longer hidden in shadows. It was laid bare, undeniable, a wound on the family's already fragile bond. In the days that followed, the daughter was locked away. Servants whispered of cries coming from her room at night. Some claimed they saw the father carrying vials of dark liquid into her chamber. Others swore they heard prayers, chanted in a lang, waged none of them recognized. Whatever he was doing, it left her weakened. When she was finally allowed to leave the room, her skin was pale, her eyes sunken, but her defiance still burned. She smiled faintly at her siblings, as if to remind them that she had not been broken. The younger children grew restless after seeing their sister's suffering. They began to resist in small ways, refusing meals, questioning their father's orders, sneaking away into the garden after dark. Each act of rebellion chipped away at his control, but also pushed him deeper into paranoia. He believed the outside world was closing in, that his family's secret would be torn from him. He clung tighter to his obsession, convinced that his work was the only way to keep them alive, to keep them perfect. His wife, once silent, began to change as well. Watching her children suffer stirred something long buried inside her. She began leaving small notes for them, hidden in books and under pillows, urging them to be careful, to hold on to hope. But her fear of her husband's wrath kept her from open defiance. She lived torn between loyalty to him and love for her children, a battle that left her frail and haunted. Outside the gates, the town grew bolder. Some wanted answers, others wanted proof. One night, stones were thrown at the house, shattering windows and sending servants scrambling to extinguish fires in the garden. The family huddled inside while their father stood in the doorway, pistol in hand, shouting at the mob to leave. His voice carried not just rage, but desperation, the sound of a man cornered. The siege of whispers, secrets, and defiance tightened around them, each thread pulling the family closer to collapse. The eldest daughter dreamed of escape. Her siblings clung to her hope. The mother's resolve wavered between fear and courage, and the father sank deeper into his own darkness. Each day carried with it more tension, more violence, more suspicion from the outside world. The world inside the house and the world outside its gates were colliding, and in that collision lay the spark of something inevitable. It would not be long before control snapped, before defiance demanded a price, before the family's secret, so carefully guarded for years, would spill into the open with devastating force. The air in Blackwood grew colder, heavier, as if the town itself sensed what was coming. The family that had defied time could not defy consequence forever. The night it happened began like any other, cloaked in silence and watchfulness. A storm was gathering over Blackwood, the kind that rattled windows and pressed down on the town with a suffocating weight. Inside the house, candles flickered weakly, their flames bowing under the draft that slipped through the cracks of shuttered windows. The family gathered around the dining table as they always did, plates laid out in careful order, silver gleaming, wine poured. But beneath the surface, the air was charged, restless, as if every breath carried the weight of unspoken truths. The eldest daughter sat rigid, her eyes fixed on her father. The bruises from his last strike had faded, but the fire in her gaze had only grown. Her siblings looked to her for courage, their small acts of rebellion having pulled them closer to her side. The mother sat between them all, hands trembling as she reached for her glass, her mind split between fear and a quiet yearning for freedom. The father, unaware of the silent alliances forming round him, carved into the roast with the same precision he used in everything. His voice cut through the silence with questions about lessons, behavior, and obedience. No one answered. That silence ignited him. His voice rose, sharp and accusing, calling them ungrateful, calling them weak. He slammed his knife against the table, the silver clattering as the children flinched. The storm outside cracked with thunder, shaking the walls, and in that moment, the house felt like a cage about to shatter. The eldest daughter could not stay silent any longer. She pushed back her chair, her voice breaking through the noise. She demanded answers in front of them all. Why had they never grown older? Why had their lives been stolen from them in the name of his obsession? Why had he turned their home into a prison while the world outside moved on? The children's wide eyes turned to their father, waiting, hoping for something that resembled truth, but instead of answers, he gave rage. He rose, towering over her, his face twisted with fury. His words dripped with venom as he called her a traitor, cursed her for questioning his life's work. His hand shot across the table, gripping her arm with a force that made her cry out. Her siblings rose from their chairs, fear and anger colliding in their young faces. The mother screamed for him to let go, but he ignored her. His obsession had consumed him, and in his mind, defiance was betrayal. The daughter's desperation turned into action. With her free hand, she grabbed the nearest object, a heavy silver candlestick. Tears blurred her vision. Her heart pounded against her ribs, and in a moment of blind fury and survival, she struck. The sound of metal against bone echoed through the dining room, louder than the thunder outside. Her father staggered back, blood running down his temple, his eyes wide with disbelief. The room erupted into chaos. The children screamed. The mother gasped, hands flying to her mouth as if she had just witnessed the world end. The father's roar filled the space as he stumbled forward, trying to seize her again, but she struck a second time, harder, driven by the years of fear and silence that had built within her. His body crumpled, the sound of his fall shaking the table and sending silverware crashing to the floor. For a long moment, there was only the storm. The candles flickered wildly, casting frantic shadows on the walls. The children huddled together, sobbing, as the eldest daughter stood frozen, the candlestick slipping from her blood-stained hands. Her chest heaved, her vision blurred, and the weight of what she had done pressed down on her like a mountain. She hadn't meant for it to happen, not like this. But the sight of his blood on the floor, the stillness of his body, left no doubt. The mother moved first. She fell to her knees beside him, pressing her hands against his wound, as if she could stop the life spilling from him. Her sobs filled the room, torn between grief and relief, as if part of her had been freed and destroyed all at once. She whispered his name over and over, shaking her head as though refusing to believe it. The daughter stepped back, her hands trembling, her breath sharp and shallow. The younger children clung to one another, their cries piercing the storm. Their world, already fragile, had shattered in an instant. They stared at their sister not with blame, but with terror. Terror of what had happened. Terror of what would come next. The father's breath came ragged, shallow, his eyes flickering with hatred and disbelief. He tried to speak, blood on his lips, but no words formed. His hand twitched, reaching out toward his daughter, not in forgiveness, but in one last act of dominance. Before he could, his strength gave way, and his hand fell limp against the floor. The silence that followed was unbearable. The mother collapsed beside him, her sobs quieting into a hollow emptiness. The eldest daughter stood numb, her body shaking as if it could no longer hold her spirit inside. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs would not move. She had saved them all from his cruelty, yet in the same breath, she had destroyed everything. Panic set in quickly. The mother turned on her daughter, her grief spilling into fury. She accused her of murder, of destroying the family, of tearing apart the fragile balance they had clung to for so long. The daughter's lips parted, but no words came. The truth of his cruelty, the experiments, the lies, none of it mattered now. All that mattered was the blood on the floor and the dead man in their dining room. The younger children cried out for answers. Some clung to their mother, others to their sister. The family had split in two in an instant, loyalty torn by grief and fear. The daughter tried to explain, her words shaking, her voice broken, but no one could hear her over the storm of emotions. The mother's thoughts spiraled into panic. What would the town say? What would the outsiders who already suspected their secret do if they found out the father was dead? His body would raise questions. His absence would bring suspicion. She spoke of hiding it, of covering everything up, of keeping their secret safe. Her voice was frantic, her hands shaking as she wiped blood from the floor with her dress. The daughter stared at her mother, horrified. She had expected anger, perhaps even exile, but not this. To cover it up meant becoming part of his madness, part of the very prison they had tried to escape. Yet even as she shook her head, she realized she had no power left. She had acted in rage, in desperation, and now she was trapped in the web of consequences that followed. The storm outside howled louder, rain pounding against the windows as if the night itself bore witness. Inside, the house was no longer a home, but a tomb filled with fear, betrayal, and grief. The father's lifeless body lay on the floor. The children wept. The mother clung to denial, and the eldest daughter stood frozen, her soul breaking under the weight of what she had done to it. Was the moment that ended their silence forever. The moment when control gave way to chaos, when the secret they had kept so tightly cracked open. The crime was not just the death of a man. It was the death of a family, of a fragile illusion, of years spent bound by fear. And though the storm would pass, the echoes of that night would haunt them, twisting their lives into something darker than even their father's obsession had ever created. The storm passed, but the silence it left behind was worse than the thunder. The house smelled of iron and wax, the bloodstains on the wooden floor refusing to fade, even after the mother scrubbed at them until her hands bled. The father's body was carried into a hidden chamber by candlelight, his face pale and rigid in death, and the family gathered around him in disbelief. No one spoke of prayers or final words. His passing was not mourned in the way most deaths are. It was tangled with fear, guilt, and a heavy sense of shame. The mother slipped into denial almost instantly. She insisted he wasn't truly gone, that perhaps he was only resting, that his genius could not end in such a brew. Ordinary way. She tended to his body as if it still required care, brushing his hair, straightening his clothes, whispering words of forgiveness that sounded more like pleas. When the eldest daughter tried to reason with her, she was met with a blank stare and the same repeated words. He provided everything. He knew what was best. He will return. The grief had twisted into madness, and the woman who had once quietly resisted him was now clinging desperately to the very man who had broken her. The eldest daughter carried the heaviest burden of all. The candlestick weighed on her, even though it no longer sat in her hands. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the moment his body crumpled, heard the sickening sound of bone cracking, felt the warmth of his blood on her skin. Her siblings looked at her with wide, searching eyes, not with hatred, but with a mixture of fear and dependency. To them, she was both savior and destroyer, the one who had freed them from his cruelty, but also the one who had shattered what little security they had left. She tried to comfort them, but her words fell flat, choked by the guilt that gnawed at her. The younger children grew restless in the weeks that followed. They whispered among themselves at night, asking if their father would rise again, if the punishment for his death would fall on them too. Some clung to the hope that life would return to normal without him, while others feared he would somehow find them even in death. Their innocence had been stolen in a single night, replaced by nightmares and a constant sense of dread. The servants, those who remained, lived in terror. Some begged to leave, others stayed out of loyalty or fear of what would happen if they spoke. Rumors spread quickly beyond the iron gates. Strange deliveries of wood and stone were brought in to conceal what had been done, while the family's sudden disappearance from public life only fueled suspicion. The townspeople, who had long whispered about the family's strange refusal to age, now spoke openly of curses, sins, and punishment. Their respect for the father's wealth and standing collapsed into scorn. What had once been seen as enviable now seemed unnatural and dangerous. Strangers began to arrive in Blackwood. Curiosity seekers, men of science, even journalists who had caught wind of the story. They asked questions about the family, about why their gates were shut, and why no one had seen the father in weeks. Some claimed to hear wailing from within the house at night. Others swore the garden had begun to wither, as if the earth itself had turned against them. Suspicion grew into anger. What was once awe had become fear, and fear demanded answers. Inside the home, the mother worked tirelessly to create a story that would protect them. She spoke of illness, of seclusion, of needing privacy in their grief. She forbade the children from speaking of the crime, insisting that silence was the only way to survive. Her obsession with maintaining control in her husband's absence mirrored his own. The daughter saw it clearly, the cycle repeating itself, and yet she lacked the strength to fight. Her guilt consumed her, leaving her hollow. She began to believe that perhaps her mother was right, that perhaps what she had done was not justice but sin. The emotional toll spread like a poison. The siblings grew divided, some siding with their mother, clinging to her denial, others clinging to their sister, desperate for the truth to be. He spoke aloud. The once tight bond of secrecy fractured under the weight of blame and confusion. Meals were eaten in silence. The halls that once echoed with piano music, now heavy with despair. The house itself seemed to groan under the strain, its walls closing in as though it, too, carried the burden of what had been done. The outside world did not wait. News of the family's condition spread quickly beyond Blackwood. Articles were printed about the House of Eternal Youth, filled with speculation, half-truths, and outright lies. Some painted them as victims of a rare medical miracle, others as sinners who had defied God's natural order. A few even suggested the father had made deals with the devil, binding his family to eternal suffering. The family's once untouchable reputation lay in ruins. The legal consequences were never straightforward. The father had been a man of influence, and his sudden absence left gaps that authorities could not ignore. Questions of inheritance, property, and guardianship arose. Officials demanded to see him, but the mother refused, claiming he was too ill to receive visitors. Each refusal tightened the noose around them. drawing more suspicion. In the eyes of the law, something was deeply wrong, but without proof, no action was taken. It was only a matter of time before the truth clawed its way out. The daughter lived in constant fear of that day. She imagined soldiers tearing through the gates, dragging her away, sentencing her for murder. But worse than that was the fear of her own reflection. She could not look into a mirror without seeing her father's blood, without hearing the sound of his final breath. She began to withdraw, her laughter gone, her eyes hollow. She carried herself like someone twice her age, though her body had not aged a day. The contradiction of her frozen youth and broken spirit made her feel like a ghost. Why? Thin her own skin. In the community, people who once envied the family now pointed at their house with disgust. Children dared one another to touch the gates, calling it cursed. Women crossed the street rather than walk beside it. Men gathered in taverns, debating whether to confront the family or drive them out. What had once been quiet suspicion had turned into open hostility. Their wealth no longer protected them. Their name no longer carried respect. The ripple effects reached beyond the family, staining everyone connected to them. Former servants were questioned, pressed for details they dared not share. A doctor who once visited the home was hounded by journalists, his silence only fueling speculation. Even those who had defended the family in the past now distanced themselves, unwilling to be caught in the storm of scandal. The aftermath of the crime was not just the loss of the father, but the unraveling of everything they had built to keep their secret hidden. The daughter's act of defiance had freed them from his cruelty, but it also condemned them to a life of fear, suspicion, and shame. The mother's denial trapped them further, chaining them to the very silence they had once tried to escape. The children's innocence was gone, replaced by a hollow knowledge that no one would ever look at them the same again. The town of Blackwood would never forget the family that did not age, nor the crime that shattered their walls. And within those walls, the survivors lived each day as though they were waiting, not for peace, not for justice, but for the inevitable reckoning that would one day come. The crime had ended one man's reign, but its shadow lingered, stretching long across their lives, a constant reminder that time might have spared their bodies, but had destroyed their souls. The courtroom in 1895 was quieter than most expected. The great spectacle of justice had been reduced to, oh, weary murmurs, the sound of shoes scraping against wooden floors, and the uneasy coughs of townsfolk who had come not out of duty, but out of curiosity. The once whispered story of the family that refused to age had become a trial, a performance for the public. Faces that once carried the strange mask of eternal youth now looked drawn, worn, and defeated. No illusion of perfection remained. In its place was the stark reality of guilt, shame, and the fragility of human life when secrets are dragged into daylight. Legal consequences came swiftly, though not all agreed justice had truly been served. Elias, once the proud head of the household, stood in chains, his confident bearing shattered. He had argued that his actions, his experiments, his deceptions, were driven not by cruelty, but by love, a desire to preserve his family against the march of time. Yet the law had no room for such defenses. Manslaughter charges for the death of one child, fraud for the lies spun to the community, and a host of accusations of medical misconduct crushed whatever pride he had left. His sentence was heavy, but not final enough for some. To neighbors who had once envied the family, prison felt too kind. To others, it was almost tragic, a brilliant but delusional man undone by his own obsessions. His wife, Margaret, walked free, though not unscathed. The court decided she had been more a victim than a co-conspirator, trapped in her husband's world of control and silence. But freedom came at a cost. The town no longer looked at her with admiration, but with suspicion, pity, and quiet judgment. To them, she had either known too much or turned her head too often. She retreated into a lonely existence, her reputation in tatters. What once made her enviable, a youthful glow, an unchanging face, now marked her as cursed. The children, though spared legal judgment, carried the heaviest burden. Their youth, preserved for so long, now betrayed them. Once viewed as a miracle, their appearance became unsettling to others, a reminder of their father's interference with nature. They struggled to find their place in the world outside Black Hollow. Employers refused them, schools shunned them, and whispers followed them wherever they went. They lived as shadows of themselves, marked not by what they had done, but by what had been done to them. Some tried to rebuild, marrying, moving to distant cities, attempting to bury the past. Others could never escape it, haunted by the laughter, the endless experiments, and the knowledge that their innocence had been stolen long before the crime itself unfolded. The wider community did not come out of the scandal unscathed either. For years, Black Hollow carried the reputation of being a place where something unnatural had taken root. Families who had once taken pride in their moral standing now bore the mark of complicity. Many asked themselves why they had never spoken sooner, why they had ignored the unease in their stomachs, why they had whispered but never acted. It was easier to believe in the myth of eternal youth than to face the possibility of abuse and manipulation happening in plain sight. That silence became its own form of guilt. The story spread far beyond the town. Newspapers painted the family as monsters, angels, victims, or villains, depending on the slant they chose. To some, the case was evidence of human arrogance, of trying to master forces that were never meant to be controlled. To others, it was simply another crime of power and deception, one family using their influence and secrecy to hide what others might not have been able to. The fascination endured, not just because of the crime itself, but because of what it revealed about age. Human desire, the fear of aging, the hunger for control, the lengths people would go to keep time from winning as the years passed. People look back on the tragedy not just as a singular crime, but as a cautionary tale. The case forced questions about medicine, ethics, and morality that lingered well into the next century. Should science interfere with the natural order? What happens when love turns into obsession, when protection becomes control? Elias's downfall showed how quickly the pursuit of power, even if disguised as care, could destroy everything it touched. For those closest to the case, justice felt incomplete. Some believed Elias's sentence did not undo the years of manipulation. Others argued that no punishment could ever truly balance the scale of what had been lost: a child's life, a family's trust, a town's innocence. Justice, in the end, was less about what the courts delivered and more about the scars that remained. The broader truth of the story was harder to escape. Power, in all its forms, whether in science, wealth, or reputation, had shaped the crime from the beginning. Elias used it to control his family. The town's silence allowed it to fester. The law tried to reassert balance, but even then, questions lingered about fairness and morality. In the end, the family that once seemed frozen in time was undone by it. Age finally touched them, not in their faces or their bodies, but in the weight of regret, guilt, and isolation. The illusion of immortality had broken, leaving behind only fragile, flawed people. The story of their rise and fall became less about eternal youth and more about eternal consequences. And perhaps that is the most haunting truth of all. No matter how far one tries to escape it, time always catches up, not just through the body but through the soul, through the memories that cannot be erased, through the pain that lingers long after the crime is over. For Black Hollow, for the family, and for all who watched, the tragedy was a reminder that the greatest crime is not only what we do to others, but what we try to take from life itself.